Callen and Maddox Drayke were the kind of brothers who didn't just break the rules. They rewrote them in blood, building an empire of fear on the streets of Scotland, and that no one dared challenge until the night it all came crashing down. Bode, Glasgow's winter air, always carried a certain heaviness, the kind that seeped into bone and stayed there even long after the cold had passed. In the narrow back streets of the city, broken lampposts and cracked brick walls, two brothers grew up watching the world from the bottom rung. Callen Drayke, the older one by 3 years, was quiet and sharp-eyed, the kind of boy who noticed every detail, from who owed money at the corner shop to which neighbors didn't lock their sheds at night. Maddox Drayke, younger and wilder, was a storm from the start. Quick to fight, quicker to break things, always daring the world to push back. Together, they learned early that no one would hand them anything. Their childhood was marked by neglect. Their father had disappeared when Maddox was still a toddler. And their mother, a wary woman named Isla, was too lost in bottles and unpaid bills to shield them from the harshness outside their door. Nights were long in that crumbling house by the River Clyde, rain leaking through the roof and the sound of arguments from the neighboring flats filling the air. Hunger gnawed at them more than once, and shame became a familiar companion. But Callen and Maddox made a silent promise to each other they would not live like this forever. It started as a game, or at least it felt like one when they were boys. They snatched loaves of bread from market stalls, slipped wallets from coats hanging by pub doors, and returned home with their pockets full of coins. Maddox laughed through it all, thinking it was just mischief, but Callen saw more in it. He saw the outlines of power forming, possibility that fear could be more valuable than money. By the time Callen was 15, he had stopped looking for teachers to impress or jobs to apply for. Instead, he studied the men who ruled the streets. The loan sharks, the enforcers, the men with sharp suits and sharper knives. The brothers made their first real move when they were still teenagers. A local dealer had been robbed, and everyone in their part of Glasgow whispered about who might have done it. Callen and Maddox didn't just steal the goods. They resolved them quietly, carefully slipping into a world much darker than petty theft. The thrill of it was addictive, always, and every risk they took seemed to pay off, and every narrow escape only emboldened them. But with each success, they grew colder. The lines between survival and cruelty blurred. Maddox, impulsive and hot-blooded, started fights in alleyways, leaving rivals broken on the pavement. Callen rarely got his own hands dirty, but his mind was ablade, cutting paths and laying traps, always calculating how one small act could ripple into something larger. One rainy evening, as teenagers on the brink of adulthood, they sat in the abandoned train yard where they often met to plan their next move. They cut their palms with a rusted knife they'd found and pressed their bleeding hands together, sealing a blood oath under the broken roof of an old rail car. They swore they would never go hungry again, never be stepped on, and never back down, no matter what it cost. That moment was more than just childish defiance. It was the birth of something much bigger, something darker. The oath became their guiding force, a thread running through every choice they made from that night on. Neighbors began to notice a change in the brothers. They no longer seemed like scrappy kids trying to get by. They were sharper, colder, almost unsettling. People avoided their eyes, sensing something dangerous simmering beneath the surface. By the time they left their teenage years behind, the Drayke brothers were no longer just two boys from a broken home. They were becoming a force, a shadow growing larger in the streets of Glasgow, ready to swallow anyone foolish enough to stand in its way. The Drayke brothers didn't climb to power overnight, but when they began to rise, it was unstoppable, like a storm rolling in from the sea. By their early 20s, Callen and Maddox had already outgrown petty theft and low-level hustles. The scraps they had once fought for on the streets no longer satisfied them. They wanted more money. Respect and something far more intoxicating, control. Callen, always the thinker, started pulling the strings while Maddox, with his volatile temper and unshakable presence, became the face of their growing reputation. It began with a crew of restless young men from the estates, kids who had grown up the same way the Drakes had. Poor, angry, and invisible to the rest of the world. Callen offered them something no one else ever had: a sense of belonging. He gave them a name, the Drayke Clan, and with that came loyalty sealed in violence. What started as a ragtag group of small-time thieves quickly turned into an organized force. They controlled which dealers worked which corners, decided which pubs stayed safe and which ones paid for protection, and built an unspoken ruling. If you crossed the brothers, as always, you didn't just risk losing money, you risked losing everything. Their early operations were clever. Callen used his knack for strategy to keep the police confused and rivals guessing. They stole cars, not the flashy kind that drew attention, only the ones that could be stripped for parts or used in quick getaways. They ran protection rackets in such a way that the victims didn't even realize they had agreed to it until they were already paying. Slowly, their grip tightened on neighborhoods, and their name spread like smoke. Maddox's reputation for violence helped enforce that control. He didn't negotiate. He didn't bluff. He made examples of anyone who doubted him. Soon, they pushed into drug trafficking. At first, it was small shipments tucked away in hidden compartments of delivery vans, but it wasn't long before they struck a deal with an Eastern European contact who could move larger quantities. Callen saw the opportunity and seized it. Money began pouring in faster than they could count it, and with money came more power. They bought off small-time cops, set up fronts with legitimate businesses, and built a network so tight that anyone who tried to speak out found themselves silenced, sometimes through threats, sometimes through something much worse. The brothers played different roles, but together they were unstoppable. Callen was cold and methodical, a planner who rarely showed emotion. He preferred to stay behind the scenes, making deals and weaving connections, the kind of leader who could orchestrate chaos without raising his voice. Maddox was the opposite, a living warning to anyone who thought of defying them. His temper was infamous. One wrong word, one sign of disrespect, Maddox would unleash a violence that no one forgot. The combination worked. People feared Maddox, but they feared Callen's mind even more because he always seemed to be 5 steps ahead. The police knew exactly who the Drayke brothers were, but they couldn't pin anything on them. Every raid turned up nothing useful. Every witness suddenly forgot what they had seen. Some were bribed into silence, others simply vanished. The Drakes had created an empire built on fear, and fear was stronger than any law. By the time they reached their mid-20s, the Drayke Clan wasn't just a crew. It was an institution in the underworld of Scotland. Their reach stretched from the narrow lanes of Glasgow to the coastal towns. Their influence felt in every shady deal and whispered threat. For the brothers, always, it wasn't enough to be powerful. They wanted to be untouchable. And for a while, it seemed they were. Lennox Vale was the kind of man who thought he couldn't be touched. He owned one of the most popular nightclubs in Glasgow, a noon-lit palace where footballers, small-time celebrities, and the city's rich kids all came to drink and forget themselves. He dressed sharp, spoke louder than necessary, and made sure everyone knew he had connections, even if most of those connections were exaggerated. When the Drayke brothers approached him with their offer of protection, Lennox laughed it off. He told anyone who would listen that he didn't pay criminals for anything, and he made the mistake of saying it too many times in the wrong places. Word reached Callen and Maddox and in their world, open disrespect was something you couldn't afford to ignore. At first, they tried their usual tactics: subtle pressure, quiet intimidation, a few broken bottles left outside the club's back door. Lennox didn't flinch. He liked the attention, boasting that even the Drayke brothers couldn't scare him. For Callen, it wasn't just about money anymore. It was about reputation. If they let one man stand up to them, others might follow. Maddox didn't care about strategy. He just wanted to teach Lennox a lesson he wouldn't forget. One rainy Thursday night, Lennox hosted an exclusive event at his club. Champagne flowed, music thumped, and cameras flashed. But by the next morning, Lennox Vale was gone. His car, an expensive black Jaguar, was found hours later on a lonely cliffside road. The doors were open, the keys were still in the ignition, and rain had washed away almost every trace of what had happened. Almost. Rumors began immediately. Some said Lennox had been taken to a remote farmhouse in the Highlands, where the Drakes had a loyal contact who would do their dirtiest work. Others whispered about a pig farm, an ugly story that no one dared repeat too loudly. The nightclub crowd whispered nervously, and people who once laughed at the Drayke name suddenly locked their doors and watched their words. The brothers didn't confirm or deny anything. They didn't need to. The silence around Lennox Vale became part of their power. The police launched one of the biggest investigations the city had seen in years. Detectives combed through security footage, scored Lennox's business dealings, and questioned everyone from his bartenders to his family. But every trail seemed to lead nowhere. Callen and Maddox were questioned more than once, sitting calmly across from officers, offering polite smiles and airtight alibis. They spoke carefully, never giving away a single detail, while witnesses who might have been able to place them near Lennox that night either disappeared or suddenly refused to speak. For a time, it seemed as if Lennox's disappearance would remain another unsolved mystery, one more story to add to the growing legend of the Drayke brothers. But there was one thing they hadn't counted on. Someone had seen what happened that night. It wasn't a rival gang or an enemy looking for revenge. It was someone close, someone who moved in their shadow every day. They had witnessed the meeting, the argument, and the moment things turned violent. They hadn't spoken, not yet, but secrets have a way of slipping through cracks no matter how tightly they're sealed. The disappearance of Lennox Vale became the turning point. As always, the fear it created strengthened the Drayke clan's grip, but it also drew more attention than they wanted. It marked the beginning of something neither Callen nor Maddox could control, a chain of events that would twist their empire into knots and lead them closer to the one thing they thought would never touch thing, the betrayal. Inside the Drayke clan, loyalty was supposed to be absolute, but nothing stays unbroken forever. Ewan Carrick had been with Callen and Maddox from the early days, one of the first to join their crew when it was little more than a group of angry young men looking for purpose. He was older than most of the recruits, steadier, with the kind of quiet presence that made him valuable. For years, he had carried out orders without question, collecting debts, guarding shipments, and standing watch when things got bloody. But Lennox Vale's disappearance changed something in him. Ewan had been there the night Lennox vanished. He hadn't meant to see what he saw, but once he did, he couldn't erase it. The memory lingered, waking him in the middle of the night, heavy and sharp, like glass lodged under his skin. He told himself he could live it the same way he'd lived with every other dark thing the Drakes had done, but guilt has a way of digging deeper, eating away at the edges until there's nothing left but cracks. Meanwhile, Callen's empire kept expanding and Maddox's violence grew harder to contain. Maddox no longer needed much reason to lash out. An insult, a delay in payment, even a look he didn't like could trigger an eruption. Ewan had seen enough to know that Maddox wasn't just dangerous to enemies. He was dangerous to the people closest to him. That knowledge made the guilt even heavier. The decision to talk to the police didn't come all at once. It built slowly over weeks of sleepless nights and gnawing thoughts until one rainy evening, Ewan walked into a quiet back office at a police station and asked someone he could trust. It was a risk so enormous it felt like stepping off a cliff, but he did it anyway. He told them he couldn't hand over everything at once, but he could start with information they'd been desperate for: details about the Drayke's operations, safe houses, and shipments. The police didn't waste time. They wired him, sent him back into the Drayke Clan with a hidden microphone, and began to gather every word, every careless admission. Callen's voice was rarely caught. He was too cautious, too deliberate. But Maddox was reckless. He bragged after too many drinks, spoke too freely in moments of rage, and his words became the first real cracks in the brothers' untouchable image. At first, neither Callen nor Maddox noticed the slow unraveling. They couldn't ignore the signs for long. One drug shipment disappeared on a quiet coastal road. A safe house they thought was secret was raided. Associates began to complain that their phones were tapped, that the walls felt thinner. Maddox's temper flared, and he accused rivals of trying to dismantle their empire piece by piece. Callen stayed silent, studying every failure, knowing something wasn't right. When suspicion finally fell on someone within their inner circle, the search for the traitor became as consuming as the empire itself. Callen started watching his men more closely, asking questions that didn't sound like questions. Maddox's way was simpler. Threats, intimidation, the occasional outburst that left someone bloodied. Eventually, the truth surfaced. A name? Ewan Carrick. The man who had once been as trusted as a brother was suddenly the reason cracks had formed in everything they had built. Maddox's fury was immediate, wild, and uncontrollable. Callen's reaction was colder, but far more dangerous. He didn't yell. He didn't hit walls. He planned. They wouldn't take revenge quickly. Callen decided Ewan's punishment needed to be more than a beating or a disappearance. It had to be a message, a warning carved so deep that no one would dare betray them again. But what Callen didn't realize was that every word he spoke about revenge, every whisper of their next move, already being recorded. The brothers believed they were about to silence a traitor. In reality, they were stepping straight into a trap they couldn't see coming. The night the Drayke brothers moved against Ewan Carrick was meant to reestablish their dominance. Callen chose the place himself. An abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Glasgow, a forgotten space where the wind howled through broken windows and puddles formed on the cracked concrete floor. It was the kind of place where screams would vanish into the night. Maddox was almost giddy, pacing like a caged animal as they waited, a heavy iron pipe clutched in his hand. He wanted blood. Callen wanted order. Neither of them suspected they were walking into the end of everything. The police had been listening for weeks. Every plan whispered, every coded phrase analyzed. When the brothers arranged for Ewan to meet them, the authorities didn't hesitate. They prepared a trap. Hidden surveillance vans lined the street that night, their lights off, their engines silent. Dozens of armed officers waited for the signal to move, their radios crackling softly as the rain came down harder. Ewan arrived under the weight of his own dread, escorted by men who didn't know he had already betrayed them. He stepped into the warehouse knowing he might not walk out again. Maddox greeted him with a twisted smile, his eyes gleaming with something feral, while Callen stayed further back, his face unreadable as always. The confrontation began the way all of Maddox's confrontations did. Loud, violent, chaotic. He swung the pipe first, sending sparks off a metal beam when Ewan ducked out of instinct. The sound echoed like a gunshot, and that was the moment the trap was sprung. Shouts erupted outside. followed by the crash of doors breaking open. Armed police flooded the warehouse, their boots thundering against the concrete. The brothers barely had time to react. Maddox roared and charged, swinging his pipe at anyone who came near. He fought like an animal cornered, smashing through boxes, hurling debris, screaming until his voice was raw. Officers swarmed him, tackling him to the ground, tasers snapping, fists flying. Callen didn't fight. He didn't raise a hand or make a move for a weapon. He simply stood there, rain dripping off his coat, watching everything unfold with a strange calm. When they cuffed him, he didn't resist. Just stared at the floor, his mind already spinning through calculations, as if he were trying to rewrite the ending in real time. But there would be no rewriting. Iwe's Ewan survived the night. His betrayal became the key the authorities had been waiting for, and with the brothers in custody, the dam burst. People who had stayed silent for years suddenly found their voices. Former allies came forward, rivals handed over evidence, and terrified witnesses testified at what they'd seen and endured. The trial that followed was one of the most infamous in Scotland's history. The courtroom was packed every day, a grim theater where former victims stared at the brothers from the Gallagher, some in relief. Prosecutors laid out years of crimes in meticulous detail. Drug shipments, extortion, beatings, and the chilling mystery of Lennox Vale's disappearance. Maddox raged through the hearings, slamming his fists on the table, shouting at witnesses, needing the world to know he was still dangerous. Callen remained unnervingly composed, his eyes fixed on the judge, his voice calm when he did speak. He seemed to believe that even here, even in the courtroom, he could find a way to control the narrative. He couldn't. The sentences were brutal. Callen Drayke was given life without parole, his brilliant mind trapped behind bars forever. Maddox, declared unstable after violent outbursts in custody, was sent to a high-security psychiatric prison, his fury contained by locked doors and medication. Glasgow's streets slowly began to breathe again, but the shadow of the Drayke brothers lingered. Whispers spread of hidden catches of money, of loyal followers who still toasted their names in darkened bars. Their empire had fallen, but the legend remained, a reminder that even the most dangerous kings of the underworld can be brought down, and that the climb to power is never as treacherous as the fall.